Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of my geoguessr speedrun tips series. This time, I will be going through the countries of South America to give you tips on how to 5k them fast. This is one of my favorite regions of the world to speedrun, since the approach to it is quite different and usually involves trying to parse large bits of information as fast as possible. With that said, let's get right into it. Since almost every country on the continent speaks Spanish, knowing a couple of Spanish words can be very helpful. Knowing words like carretera, ruta, and tramo can be very beneficial since you often see signs that say things like carretera followed by two place names, which just means that you're on the highway between those two places. Some political words can also be quite helpful since there are lots of political advertisements on the continent. So if you can see things like alcalde de Ica, then you know it talks about the mayor of Ica, which means you will have to be somewhere vaguely around Ica. On a related note, knowing what each country calls its subdivisions is also very helpful since they also appear on a lot of construction signs. So knowing provincia, departamento, and región can be very useful. Indeed, first level subdivisions appear a lot. Second level subdivisions can also be quite useful to know. Lower level subdivisions, perhaps not so much. If you want to take a closer look at the image, feel free to pause the video or click in the link in the description. Knowing some geographical words can also be quite helpful. For example, there are lots of place names called Puerto something, which will indicate that you're either on the sea or at the very least next to a big river. Similarly, Argentina and Uruguay has lots of places called balneario something, which are likely, although not always, next to the sea. Words like lago for lake, rio for river, as well as cardinal directions can be helpful in very similar ways. However, there are also a few words that you should never look for. We've all seen new players try to stand for things like curva peligrosa for 10 minutes, only to find out that it only means dangerous curve. There are also a few Portuguese words summarized here, since Brazil is the only non-Spanish speaking country on the continent. Most of them are quite understandable from English, as well as Spanish. The one thing I would like to highlight is rodovia for highway. Once again, feel free to pause the video if you want to look at these more, but I have also linked them in the description. First, let's start with Argentina, where a lot of the best information comes in the form of road numbers and road signs. One of the best things you can find is these kilometer markers, which will say the road number on the top. So for example here RN 188 means it's the National Road 188, and which kilometer of the road you are on underneath it, which you can then use to approximate where on the road you can be. You can also often find these road numbers on various sites, like here for example is a sign with only road numbers on it. One thing worth noting is these two shield shapes. The one shaped like a shield is national roads, also often abbreviated as RN, which only occur once in the country, and the other, the rectangular ones, are provincial roads, which can occur once in each province. Sometimes you also find them abbreviated as RP. National roads are also quite logically numbered. It is a bit convoluted at first, but it's pretty easy once you get the hang of it. Numbers 1 through 14 radiate out of Buenos Aires, so for example 1 is this short road between Buenos Aires and La Plata, and there is the 2 all the way through 14 along the borders with Uruguay and Brazil. Then, numbers 16 through 30 are east-west roads, so for example the 16 is here, the numbers keep increasing, so for example this is 25 and 26. Numbers 33 through 40 are north-south roads, so for example the 40 is this very long road that stretches all along the border with Chile. Then, higher numbers are regionally numbered. I will put up an image of the exact numbering system on the screen, but essentially they increase from north to south. So for example, this rough area will have numbers 51 through 80, and this will have 81 through 100. And if you go all the way south, this will have 256 through 300. You also often encounter these distance signs with lots of place names on it, and usually at least one of them will be quite big. Most of the places in Argentina that appear on a lot of signs show quite early, although there are a few counterexamples. For example, here in Buenos Aires province, a lot of place names show quite late, and also places like Resistencia are hidden by Corrientes, or Santiago del Estero is hidden by Termas de Rio Hondo. But mostly, if there is a place name far away, it will show quite early on, and if not, then you will remember it pretty quickly because there are not too many of those. Intersections are also often well signed. Sometimes they will even have a road number underneath them, like here is the Provincial 27, although sometimes it can be national roads as well. And sometimes, like here, it will also say the intersecting road on top, but often it will just be the place names, in which case you need to have a good vibe guess or an awareness of where the places are. When you drive into towns, you also often get these town entry signs, which can be quite helpful if you have a road number or a region guess and you can angle guess in combination with it. You can also occasionally get these construction signs painted in the Argentine national colors. Usually they will say a road number like, Ruta Nacional 232 here, or place names that are it's in between, like the line right after it, or the province that it's in. If you have a bit of extra time to learn, I recommend looking at phonecodes, since they appear on quite a lot of advertisements, like they do here, and they're quite easy to learn. I will put up an image both on the screen and in the description made by Macam that summarizes the Argentinian phonecodes. If you want to specialize in Argentina, you could also take a look at street signs, since they're unique to each city. So for example, this one is a Cordoba sign. I tried doing this last year for the Team World Cup and found that it is quite low yield, so I wouldn't recommend that you do it unless you really want to specialize in this country. Finally, a little bit of niche meta are these black and white road signs and road number markers that are exclusive to provincial roads in Cordoba. For Bolivia, since coverage is very limited and signage is quite sparse, best advice I can give is learn what each area or even road looks like, and they use load angles to 5K. If you don't know how, check out my previous video. That said, there are a few more things you can use to 5K. For example, construction signs are fairly common and will usually say a municipality name. There's also this style, which is often quite faded and usually hard to read the words, but you can often just about make out something. For these, municipality names require a little bit of region guessing, since region names are quite useless, since there's only about 6 of them with coverage, but usually these make your job a lot easier. These blue and white ads for the political party Movimiento al Socialismo can also sometimes have place names, like here El Choro. The same applies as it does for construction signs, that you will usually need to have a rough idea of where you are before being able to find the town. The last two things that can help you are road signs, usually green and white, sometimes blue and white, and very rarely these road number shields, which can also appear on road signs sometimes. In Brazil, your best friend is going to be these kilometer markers with a road number on top. If it says BR, it is a national road, and if it says something else, like GO here, it is a state road with the first two letters indicating which state you're in. These abbreviations appear on the map if you're zoomed out far enough, but learning them can be quite helpful since they appear on a lot of signs. You can sometimes have these wacky Sao Paulo pentagon shapes as well, and sometimes these signs are quite uninformative. Like here, for example, instead of a road number, you just get Norte. Also, notice that these kilometer markers are specific to the state, so here you're on kilometer 309, but as soon as you cross the state border, you will be on kilometer 2, so you can't really use it to guess which part of the road you are on. Finally, there's also these markers, which are quite a bit more rare, but these ones will have, say, the road number, so the BR242, and then the state name above it. So here it is Tocantins. Sometimes, albeit quite rarely, you can also have road numbers appear on these types of signs in blue, while place names will appear on green. Usually they will not have a state name, although in this example, there is even the two-letter state abbreviation. Road numbers in Brazil are quite logical. If the number starts with a 0, it will radiate out of Brasilia. So for example, this is the 020, 040, 060, etc. These roads usually span the entire country, so you can even find stuff like the 010 around Belém. If it starts with a 1, it's a north-south road, and the numbers increase from east to west. So for example, this coastal road here is the 101, and if you go a bit more inland, then you find numbers like the 135, and if you go all the way, then you can find numbers like 163. Twos are east-west roads, and they increase from north to south. So for example, around here you can find numbers like the 226 in the north. Then around Brasilia, it's stuff like 251. And if you go all the way south, then you see numbers like 287. If the number starts with a 3, then it's a diagonal road, which means it goes either northwest or northeast. If the number is even, then the road will go northwest, like the 364 here. And if it's odd, then it will go northeast, like the 319 here. Sometimes you can also come across numbers that start with a 4 or maybe even a 5. These are connecting highways and they are not numbered logically whatsoever. You can sometimes encounter road numbers on these overhead signs as well. Basically, whenever you leave a town, you will have some sort of an overhead sign, usually containing distances to place names, sometimes also information like road numbers or points of interest. What exactly appears on these differs from town to town, but usually you will find some sort of a useful information on them. On a similar note, when you enter towns, you can have these perimetro urbano signs. They're usually blue, although in this example it's covered by dust, and underneath it, it will often say a place name. In this example, it even says the state, like MS, although usually it is just the place name itself. Another great source of information is construction signs and advertisements. You often see a construction sign that looks something like this, which will say the municipality, like here Jaru, and the state's abbreviation, like RO, which stands for Rondônia. It can also often just say the state outright, like here Governo de Estado de Rondônia, or Rondônia State Government. Similarly, advertisements also very often contain addresses. What information they have depends from ad to ad. Sometimes it can just be the road number. Sometimes it even has full city and state information, like here Janauba and MG, which stands for Minas Gerais. Even when you don't have place names on advertisements, you usually see some sort of a phone code, like here 63. This is quite learnable. I'll put up a map on the screen and also a link in the description. And it is very helpful since it can narrow you down not to just a state, but to even parts of states. I think it's very useful. I would say I use it at least 30% of France, if not more. So if you haven't learned them, then I recommend them a lot. Here you also see a postcode, which appears on basically every street sign. I would say this is much less high yield. If you want to learn it, you can. I'll put up some resources in the description. But usually, these just appear in very urban environments where you will be able to find a phone code very soon afterwards. One thing worth noting about phone numbers is their formatting. Area codes are usually separated out, often without brackets, sometimes with a space or smaller text. If you have some very short numbers, then that means it doesn't have an area code, and if it's a very long number, but there is no two separated digits, then it will usually be some sort of a mobile number. One last thing I haven't mentioned yet is these blue signs, which occur on the border of two municipalities. Since there are a lot of municipalities in Brazil, usually this will not be enough to 5k alone, but if you have a region name or some sort of a good vibe guess or a road name, this can be extremely helpful to narrow down your 5k quickly. In Chile, signage is very common, although how useful it is varies a lot. Sometimes you get very big places like Puerto Natales here, But other times, you will get much tinier places where you have to rely on having a solid region guess to be able to find them. The main signage style is this green and white. Sometimes on highways you can also get this blue and white style though. A slightly less common but still frequent source of information is these distance signs. How useful they are varies quite a lot. Sometimes you get really far away places, but sometimes you get the small towns that are only 10 kilometers away, in which case you will once again have to rely on your vibe guess. Often you don't even need signs to 5k, especially in the north, but sometimes far south as well. Sometimes you just want to line up the road. If you don't know how, check out my previous video and find an intersection that makes sense. A slightly more rare but still very useful source of information in Chile are these kilometer markers, sometimes also in this shape, which will say the road number on the top. These are very logically organized, with the letter A being in the north, and as you get later in the alphabet, you go more south, so for example areas like Temuco will have letter S. You can also encounter quite a lot of these construction signs, which you can usually spot by this Chilean government logo with the blue and the red. What kind of information they say varies quite a lot. Sometimes they will say road numbers like they do here, or regions like they do here, sometimes municipalities, sometimes nothing. So how you approach them really differs from sign to sign, but it is very easy to spot them, and usually it is quite easy to extract some sort of a useful information from them. You can encounter regional phone numbers, like here the 073 around the town of Linares, but I would personally not bother learning these. Usually you can region guess areas quite easily, and it's generally not worth the effort to learn phonecodes. If you really want to, it can be helpful since you can see them sometimes, but I would personally not bother. One last thing worth noting is the name of two road systems that appear on signs quite a lot. The first one is the red interlagos, or between lakes network, which roughly runs around this area. I'll put up an exact map on the screen. And the other one is the Carretera Austral, or Southern Highway, which is basically the name of the Highway 7. In Colombia, there are lots of different sources of information which you could possibly use to 5k. In rural locations, the best thing you can find is one of these road number markers, which will say the road number and section number at the bottom. So here, 9005 will mean that 90, always the first two digits, is the road number, and 05 is the section number. Section numbers increase south to north and west to east, so you can use them to approximate which section of the road you are on. In older coverage, you can also see these waystones, which work very similarly. Road number, section number. If you're urban, one of the best things you can find is a taxi, bus, or commercial vehicle, since they will have a number plate printed on the side with a place name underneath it. Like right here, you can see that the number plate says Ipiales, and if you zoom out, indeed, this road is quite close to Ipiales, even though it is not necessarily inside it. To give another example, here is a taxi in the city of Cartagena, which just says Cartagena on it. Obviously, cars can move, so this can slightly mislead you, but usually if you see the name of a big city on here, then you will be quite close to it. On the bigger roads, road signs and distance signs are also quite frequent. There are two main styles. First, there's this green and white style, also again has a distance variant. The other is this white and black style, again with a distance variant. If you see one of these, they can usually be quite helpful to 5k with. Most towns in rural areas will have some sort of a welcome sign. This will usually say the name of the town and also the name of the region that you're in. Because of this, learning Colombian departments is very helpful since you see their names plastered all over the place. If you haven't yet learned them, look out for the word departamento, which is just the Spanish name for departments. It doesn't appear on every single sign, but it can help you narrow down whether or not something is a region name or not. Advertisements also very often contain place name information, including department names, like in this example, Antioquia. Because of this, I really strongly encourage you to learn your Colombian departments because they are quite easy and they're very, very helpful to know. If you have a lot of extra time on your hands, you can also try learning regional flags. I'll put up an image on the screen. These can be quite helpful since each department has its own flag and they appear reasonably frequently. That said, this is nowhere near essential, and I found that it's helpful in like maybe 5% of the rounds, so really not anything that is required. Finally, it is also worth noting that Colombia does have a regional phone numbering system, but the amount of times you see this is practically non-existent since almost all their phones are mobile. So only really learn these if you're a completionist. For Ecuador, your main source of information will be advertisements and especially construction signs, which will look something like this. They usually say the name of the province that you're in, like in this example, Loja, as well as the name of the canton, which roughly corresponds to a municipality, and the town. If you haven't yet learned your provinces, I highly recommend that you do so, since they are one of the most helpful sources of information that you could find. One quick disclaimer is that these signs will often say something like Gobierno Autónomo de something or Autonomous Government of something. You might be tempted to scan for these, but usually it is not a good idea, since Ecuador calls lots of things autonomous governments. I believe there is like a 7-page long PDF on their website of all the autonomous governments that they have. Of course, road signs and distance signs also exist in the country, and when you see one, it can be very helpful, especially if you have a decent webcast to go along with it. The usual style will be the green and white, as is the case for most of the continent. On many roads, you will also find a kilometer marker, something like this. If it's filled in green, it's a smaller road. It is slightly trickier to find, but still usually pretty findable, and if it's filled in blue, then it is a major road that you should be able to find within a matter of seconds. You can also frequently encounter signs that look something like this. What kind of information they contain varies. It can welcome you to a certain canton, like is the case here. It can talk about points of interest, etc. But sometimes it can be quite helpful to look at them. There are a few more other things worth pointing out. The first thing is this M-shaped logo for the province of Manabí. It appears on basically everything in the province, like in this case a warning sign. So once you recognize it, it can be very nice to give you a region even without a region name. If you struggle in urban environments, I can recommend looking at street signs since they're unique to each city. This, for example, is a Quito street sign. It might take a little bit of time to memorize, and it's certainly not necessary, but it can be quite helpful. Similarly, taxis can also be city specific, but I have found them to be much less high yield, and I would personally not bother unless you really want to specialize in the country. Lastly, it is also worth mentioning that a phone numbering system does exist in Ecuador, but it is not really worth learning. I will put up an image on the screen, but essentially almost all numbers you encounter will be mobile, and the ones that you don't only really narrow you down to a couple of regions, since only the first digit is actually meaningful geographically. In Peru, you will very often see signs, but it is quite rare that they're as good as the one I'm showing you here. This one has a road number shield, which also says the region name and also distances to big places. More often, you will encounter signs that look something like this. These can still have signs to big places, but very often you will just have a couple of small towns that you cannot find unless you have a very good web guess, or you can line it up with a valley that makes sense, or perhaps you find the name of a region. Finding region names on advertisements and construction signs like this one is usually quite easy, which makes them quite useful. For example, here it says Puno, which is the name of the region, then Mo, which is the second level subdivision, which Peru calls provinces or provincia, and then Conima, which is going to be the district, which is what is the third level subdivision in Peru. If a sign only has a district name or distrito, then you should not try to find it since there are over 1,800 of those in Peru. If it has a province or provincia, then taking a quick glance at the map could be somewhat useful since there are only about 200 of them, many of them appearing on the map reasonably early on. That said, usually the best way to go is find the name of a region. As I mentioned already, advertisements, as well as political ads, such as this one, can be quite a helpful source of place name information. What kind of information they contain varies from ad to ad. Many of them will contain nothing, some of them will contain a province name, and some of them even a region name. I will put up a couple of common Peruvian political party logos on the screen so that you know what to look out for when trying to look at these. When you enter a town, you will usually see a town entry sign, something like this. This will usually not be enough on its own to 5k, but going into towns is usually quite good, since that's where you will find advertisements and construction signs. I also need to warn you about these waystone looking things, which don't actually contain any useful information. They only contain the kilometer number where you are, and do not have any information about the road number, unfortunately. In Uruguay, the best thing you could possibly find is a distance sign like this. This will have the road number on the side and place names with distances on it. Also, since it's in the frame, I might as well point out that these waystones are only kilometer markers just like in Peru and contain no useful information whatsoever. Similarly, you can also encounter these type of road signs. If you're intersecting with another national road, it will have the road number on it. Otherwise, it could just be place names. If you are coming up to a bridge, which will be quite common, also look out for these signs. This will state the river name and also have a road number shield on it. The rivers can often be mismarked or not marked at all, but the road number is always very findable, and then you can usually use angle guessing to find out where you are. Speaking of which, angle guessing is a very powerful tool in Uruguay, since you'll often encounter roads like this, which are long and straight and either have no or bad quality information. Since there are not very many roads covered in the country, just lining up the road and then trying to find an intersection that makes sense can be quite a powerful tool. If you don't know how to do this, check out my previous video. In urban environments, you will usually see the town name written somewhere reasonably fast, but if you want to do some extra learning, you can take a look at street signs which are city specific. So this, for example, is a Salto street sign. Speaking of which, knowing where Salto is a very helpful thing since it shows quite late on the map, but it will appear on basically every sign in the northwestern part of the country. If you want to, you can also learn phone numbers. I'll put up a map on the screen now. But they're generally not the most helpful, and I would personally not waste my time trying to remember urban methods in a country this rural. That concludes the video. Just to recap, while place names alone can already get you quite far, learning a couple of regions in countries such as Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil, as well as a handful of common Spanish words, can help you 5k a lot faster. If you found these tips helpful, please subscribe, and see you next time for more moving geoguessr tips.